Thank you very much, and welcome everybody. I just first of all wanted to thank Jennifer for inviting me to be part of this panel, and I did want to tip my hat to Dr. Andre Turcotte and Dr. Jamie Gillis, who have been helping me with my research. This project is this presentation, I would should say, is part of a book chapter that I'm currently working on with my colleague Dr. Andre Turcotte. So maybe I could pull up my slides very quickly. I'll just share my screen. 1 second, please. Hopefully things will work perfectly.
They always do.
There we go. So everybody can see my screen. We're good. Fantastic. So really what I'm interested in today is really the fact that we're moving away from, especially in the United States, this is something that I've been noticing over the past, I would say, 10 to 20 years. We're moving away from the political issues. Political issues are still somewhat important, but are increasingly moving towards the identity of politicians, and more importantly, the identity of the culture and how this is impacting political markets. So this is something that I want to discuss over the next few minutes. Now, what we've seen over the last few years is in the contemporary political environment, we've seen a rapid transformation of different things, including the perceptions of politics, the understanding of politics, social interactions relating to politics, and also participation to politics. So if you've been following a lot of what's happening in the US, you probably noticed that the way in which people understand politics and the way people relate with politics has changed in a very significant way. And the reason why I'm sort of looking at these things is I'm truly trying to understand what are the drivers of these changes. So in the context of our work, we really focus on two angles of research. Some as have been discussed by Dr. Pelt a little bit before, but I'm really focusing on two elements. The first one is the change in the market. Specifically, I'm interested in the transformation of the understanding of citizenship, right? So there's the old models of citizenship where issues would be very important, where people would be sort of aware of what's happening in society. People would have a certain level of competence when it comes to political engagement and political knowledge. And we're slowly moving towards a new model of citizenship that really puts forth the notion of identity or self-expression, right? So self-expression becomes a key element in the way in which people take part in politics. And this is something that we see across the board. I mean, you probably saw some of the reports in the United States where you see people having Trump flags, or having Joe Biden flags, or having Bernie Sanders elements. But this has always been present in U.S. politics. But there's a sense that this is becoming at the core of the way in which people engage with politics. The second thing that I find really interesting is the notion of the changes in the delivery of political appeals. More specifically, the fact that there's a significant change in the political mediascape. Specifically, in the context of my work, I really take a hard look at the role of social media in politics. Now, we all know that social media has been playing a role in politics since 2004 in the United States with the emergence of blogs, and then we've seen Facebook, and then we've seen Instagram, we've seen Snapchat to some degree, and more recently we've seen TikTok. But what I really find interesting is how these media platforms are having some important impacts on the nature of the discourse. What is interesting about these platforms is they really push the user to put their identity at the forefront of how they engage with people. And this is a game changer, right? Because now that politics is bleeding a lot into social media activity, you see sort of this really interesting dynamic where identity and politics are merging, right? And this is really changing the way in which people understand politics, but also how people express themselves when it comes to politics. So this is why you're seeing in the United States a lot of elements relating to gender, relating to ethnicity, relating to, socio-demographic elements that are really becoming a key element through which people understand politics and also engage in politics. So these are the two really key elements that I take interest in this in my work. Now, this is a really interesting thing here is this is affecting the way in which politicians engage in positioning. Right? So positioning in the 50s, 60s, 70s would be somewhat simple, right? Because the political markets would be to a certain degree homogeneous. But now we're seeing that political markets are becoming increasingly individualized, and politicians need to make some very strategic decisions when it comes to their branding, when it comes to their messaging, and when it comes to reaching out to specific slices of the public in the United States. And what is really interesting as well is that the positioning of politicians needs to be extremely flexible, because as you probably noticed, the people's interests and perspectives and people's preferences are really very, very fluid, and they change quite a bit in short periods of times, and politicians need to be very aware of this dynamic, and more importantly, sort of manage this dynamic quite a bit. And what I'm sort of see in my research is that we're seeing a sliding away from cognitive forms of positioning, and we're really moving towards effective forms of positioning. So we're moving away from the issues, and we're moving more and more towards identity. And something that I find quite interesting is during the recent election campaign in the United States in 2020, Trump was obviously engaging with issues, but I really think that his identity and the identity traits that he was embodying in his image were really at the core of his appeal, right? So he kept promising, for example, his plan on healthcare and his plan on immigration and all these other plans. But you really saw that the identity was at the forefront of his appeal. And I truly believe that one reason why he was able to perform extremely well, despite the fact that there was COVID-19 and despite the fact that the economy was suffering quite a bit under the last few months of his presidency, it's really because his identity appeal was very strong and really kept people hooked to his messaging. So what I really find interesting, and the thing that I'm taking interest in my work, because I also work with other colleagues on Instagram in politics and TikTok in politics, so really using social media to reach out to folks across the board, is the fact that increasingly you're seeing politicians perform and own identity traits. There's this amazing work done by Daniel Kreis and his colleagues, and they really focus on the concept of identity ownership, right? So we've heard a lot about issue ownership, and that's always been an important part of politics in the United States. But I really do think we're moving towards identity ownership, right? So it's really about constructing and performing an identity and owning these identity traits that will be very appealing to certain segments of the public. And oftentimes these identity traits are really in line with some political values or positions on political issues, right? So this is something that I find really interesting, is their use of the notion of identity to build a very human connection with members of the public and develop that brand, and then use that brand to position yourself in very specific ways when it comes to appealing to the public. And this is exactly what you're seeing with populist appeals across the board in the United States. So you're seeing a very charismatic leader that embodies these political values, that embodies these stances, and they're able to really craft an identity, and they're really able to own these values and own these other elements, these cultural elements, these identity elements, that enables them to, first of all, be perceived as credible on certain issues, but also being able to push their positions on key elements. And the thing that I found really interesting about Dr. Belt's presentation is the fact that we're seeing that on the right. Obviously, we talk a lot about the populist appeal of Donald Trump and the fact that Donald Trump owned specific identity markers that really enabled him to resonate with segments of the public in the United States. But you're also seeing this on the left, right? You're seeing a lot of this when it comes to AOC, for example. The AOC brand is a very identity-based brand. So, and this is something that's oftentimes controversial in my classroom. I will oftentimes, when it comes to political marketing and political appeal, I will compare AOC to Donald Trump, because in many ways, they're very different, obviously, in terms of tone, in terms of their priorities, in terms of all these other things. But when it comes to political marketing and when it comes to brand making and identity making, they're very much in line. They have the same approach, and I do believe that they're using the same playbook when it comes to reaching out to members of the public. So I find this really interesting, because we've done a lot of work when it comes to marketing and issues. We've done a lot of work when it comes to all these other things, but identity and marketing is something that I find quite interesting, especially in the political realm. And I'm really trying to push this even further, and I cannot recommend enough the work by Daniel Kreis that deals with identity ownership, because it really forces us to think differently about how politicians are building their brand and how politicians need to be very careful when they craft their identity, because owning an identity trait, owning a specific identity trait can really help politicians be successful in certain slices of the market, and it can really help them reposition themselves quickly when it comes to discussing certain issues or discussing certain political matters. So this is sort of the type of work that I'm doing with my colleague Dr. Andre Turcotte from Carleton University, and I'm really hoping to push this a bit further in the next few years, especially with the rise of social media. Because social media, we talk a lot about the properties of social media, and I do believe that, you know, Barack Obama made some really important changes when it comes to the way in which he used these platforms for mobilization and for engagement and for fundraising. But I really do believe that Donald Trump had a tremendous impact when it comes to the tone of the discourse, right? The use of identity to reach out to members of the public in the United States. And I think that we really need to look at this carefully, because the tone and the structure of the political discourse is changing rapidly in the United States, and because of the infusion of all these identity markers. And I think a lot more research needs to be done. And how I'm suspecting that these, instead of sort of...
Sorry, just to let you know, if you can just, you know, to start wrapping up now.
I'll wrap it up really quickly. So this identity-driven form of discourse that we're seeing online is slowly going to be emerging online and having a huge impact on the way in which politicians reach out to the public online.